Lecture 11, this is a final section here. Now we're looking at Dada. Dada began in Europe in 1915 during the Great War, that is World War I. And it really is a reaction to World War I because that conflict brought unprecedented destruction and loss of life. And let me try to put that in context. During the 19th century, the Civil War was like a highly bloody affair based on the standards of the day. Combined losses from the northern and southern sides totaled a little over 200,000. Now, if we go to Europe, towards the end of the 19th century, we had something called the Franco-Prussian War, which is France against basically Germany. And during that war, 2 years, you had just under 200,000 men being killed, and that was a really high number. But if you go to World War I, these numbers just dwarf the other conflicts. In one battle, the Battle of Verdun, about 300,000 lives were lost. Another battle, the Battle of the Somme, 310,000 lives. So those two battles alone eclipsed the total dead from the other two earlier wars, which were really high casualties. When it was all over, World War I had lost nearly 10 million in military lives. If you look at total casualties, dead, wounded, military, civilian, almost 40 million are counted. And it's in that context that we see Dada. And here, so these artists and intellectuals and writers and musicians associated with the movement Dada, and Dada was more of a state of mind than just simply a movement in the visual arts. They were saying during World War I, look where Western rational thought has brought us, starting all the way back there in classical Greece, and then its revival in the Italian Renaissance, and now in the 18th century, the European Enlightenment. It brought us where? To the brink of self-annihilation. Europe was destroying itself with all of the new military inventions and this prolonged conflict that was consuming the cultural heritage of Europe as well as European lives. So Dada, here's a quiz question, was born out of protest of World War I. They wanted to bring attention to their protest by doing the opposite, behaving not like the Western rational thinker that brought us to the brink of destruction, but rather they wanted to introduce the nonsensical and the absurd. And this is their form of protest, arguing that rational thought brought us to World War I. Well, now these protesters would emphasize the irrational, trying to turn things around and stop the war. Now, when it comes to matters of the visual arts, and again, Dada was not simply confined to art, but when it came to visual arts, Dada was like the rejection of all artistic tradition. It is sometimes called anti-art, the opposite of art. But again, that's part of the protest, the irrational, absurd element being brought to the fore. Now, in the Dada movement, the most famous and influential member was Marcel Duchamp, who was a Frenchman, but he eventually moved to America. Early in his career, Duchamp, was a painter, so early in the 19th century before the outbreak of war. And here's a painting of his of chess players. He was like a real enthusiast of chess, playing chess. But when Cubism came on Duchamp's radar, he quickly adopted that language, producing this icon of modernism, his example of Cubism. It's called Nude Descending a Staircase, and painted in 1912. And so you have this sort of time-lapse photography all about movement, this female, almost like a robotic nude, coming down the staircase, making all this movement and racket. You can sort of sense that. Well, he decided to enter his Cubist piece in a show that other Cubists were putting on. But the other members, the true members of Cubism, looked at Duchamp's submission and said, "We don't like it. We would rather you not enter it because it seems to go against all the principles of analytic cubism, which was very classical, very resolved, no motion, very intellectual. In contrast to Champ's, looked like she was a jogger, going around the block and would not stay still, stay within its picture frame. So they said, we'd rather you not show it. And Duchamp, he said, fine, I won't show it. But that gave him pause. If, my paintings are really rejected by the cutting edge of the avant-garde today, 1912, so what am I supposed to do? And that gave him the occasion to think outside of the box. And that is when he moved into his Dada phase. So his Dada phase is nicely represented by this object right there. We're in a male bathroom, by the way, and that is a urinal. So he decided to take a urinal and christen it a work of art. Now here, let me introduce a concept and a term. This is an example of a found object. Normally, artists would go to an art store and buy artist material that was specifically produced to make works of art. In contrast, a found object is an object that an artist found and then incorporated it into a work of art. But the object never was originally intended to be a part of a work of art. It never intended to be artist material. But an artist can, usurp its principle and use it as art material. And that is exactly what Duchamp did with his urinal. It's a found object, and now it's a work of art. Another term I want to introduce, ready-made. That's a famous term in modern art. That is what Duchamp called a found object. So a found object is one of Duchamp's ready-mades. A ready-made by Duchamp is a found object. It's where he uses a found object for the work of art. Let's go back in time, actually to the beginning of this survey class. During the Middle Ages, artists, and we see a sculptor down there at the bottom of the page, artists were relegated to the realm of manual arts. They were people that worked with their hands, and there was no social or vocational distinction between them and other manual laborers, like a blacksmith, a cobbler, or a baker. They all worked with their hands. Yeah, and the Latin word ars, A-R-S, from which we get our word art, really meant craft. So an artist during the Middle Ages was seen as a skilled craftsman, but still someone working with their hands. And we saw this at the beginning of the semester. But in walks the Italian Renaissance, and they said, no, we're not simple manual laborers, sorry. And they looked at the list of liberal arts and saw geometry and arithmetic and said, well, look, our knowledge of geometry and perspective certainly falls within that realm. And like Michelangelo said, artists work both with their heads and their hands. So eventually, by the end of the Italian Renaissance, the visual arts entered the column of liberal arts and not under the column of manual arts. In other words, craft and concept, manual skill and intellectual activity were joined during the Italian Renaissance. And it stayed that way until Dada and Duchamp. In walks Duchamp, and he says, art is now an entirely intellectual process. That is a work of art. His found object, the urinal, is a work of art because I'm an artist and I christen that object in my head, in my intellect, as a work of art. So now, with Dada, we have concept over craft. No longer does an artist even need to make his object. He can intellectually designate anything as a work of art. And Dada, this might be a quiz question, I think it is, Dada popularized the use of found objects in modernism. It's Duchamp's use of his ready-mades that really started to bring attention to, the potential of found objects. So let's look at this piece right here. Look, he signed it R. Mutt. You can see it down there, right? And he dated it 1917, and he even gave it a title, Fountain, right? It's a urinal. So what Duchamp is arguing here, and again, he's constantly pushing the envelope. He's trying to make dissenters define their own position. He's challenging how the world thought about art. And he says here, look, what's the difference between a Rembrandt and my sculpture called the Fountain? They both are signed, they are both dated, they both have titles, and they are both absolutely useless objects. They're art. You can't use a Rembrandt for anything except to look at, and without the plumbing, you can't use the urinal except to look at it as an object. So he's saying, so what's the difference? Well, here we have another element that becomes a mainstay in modernism, one of the key elements. Painting is a flat object. Painting is non-representational. We've seen that. And now the importance is concept, not craft. It's the idea and not the fabrication behind a work of art. Look, in the 19th century, you could have an art teacher like Bouguereau up there on the right teaching his students, how to paint like him. And those students could go on and make a good living because their art was based both on concept and craft. Now with modernism, starting with Duchamp, It's all about concept. Another person could not steal the idea from Duchamp and present a urinal as a work of art. It would be rejected because it's not the intellectual property of that person. It's not the concept born from that person. It's an idea associated with Duchamp. So that really does change the rules of art production during modernism. Concept over craft. Look at those two photographs. They're not of the same object, are they? Well, there's a story behind that. The original fountain that Duchamp christened in 1917 was presented to an avant-garde art show, again with a hostile avant-garde art show. And the participants in the show just looked at Duchamp's submission. It's a urinal, right, Marcel? And then they looked at, Duchamp and then back to the urinal and said, we're not showing that. And Duchamp was cool about it because he was simply trying to get them to define their terms. What is avant-garde art? What are the limits of avant-gardism? And when they rejected the submission, he said, fine, I'll throw it away. And he did that with his ready-mades that he produced. He didn't keep them when they were rejected. He would just throw them away. He doesn't have a place to store all these things. But in 1964, it began to be clear how important Duchamp was in the development of modernism. So at that time, when his art was being rediscovered, he made these replicas of his original ready-mades, including the fountain. So he made these two. He found two old urinals, and he signed them Armut, named them the fountain, and dated it, backdated it to 1917. So they're not the original at all. I say that to say this. In 1999, one of those replicas, which indeed was signed by Duchamp, or at least Armut, right? And it was born from his concept. This is something that he recreated, and it wasn't some other artist stealing the idea. It goes to auction in 1999, and the fountain sells for what? It sells for almost $2 million, showing you the importance, the iconic importance of this piece in the development of modernism. And it's not even the original one. Who knows what that would have brought? So with Dada and Duchamp, we see how modernism's criteria has changed from the 19th century academic tradition. Modernism's criteria was important art and not good art. No one's talking about good or bad art. It's all about what is important art and how it's important to the development of modernism. And who decides its importance? Well, it's the art critic. And now we're seeing how the art world is turning to the standards of modernism as we approach the middle of the 20th century. All right, that's it. 11, we're done.